Well, let's begin there, guys. Brian here, the Three Topics Gamer, and today is a rather special day. Because I'm sure you can tell from the title, today, July 19th, 2021, actually marks the 20th anniversary of my all-time favorite, not only entry in the Final Fantasy franchise, but my favorite JRPG of all time, which, JRPGs just so happen to be my favorite genre of all time, and that being Final Fantasy X. It's crazy to think that this game is now 20 years old, and I just have so many precious memories with this game. I mean, I enjoyed this game as a kid playing for the first time, and even as an adult, even after 20 years, I still have not played a JRPG or just an RPG in general that I actually ended up enjoying anywhere near as close as this one. I mean, there have been a couple close games I did generally love, like games like Ni no Kuni: Wrath of the White Witch, Persona 5, and a few others, but they never really could quite elevate themselves in every single department like this one. I mean, this game was really revolutionary at the time. Perhaps not on the same level as, say, something like Final Fantasy VII in terms of its level of popularity, but there are a lot of fans that really do love this game and consider it their all-time favorite entry in the franchise, and I think that's perfectly justified. I mean, I think this game was definitely far ahead of its time in terms of things that it was able to pull off. I mean, this was the first game that actually introduced character with voices. It had real-time facial expressions. It had really in-depth 3D environment. It had an amazing soundtrack that included a really solid opening that really gave you a solid idea about the tone that you were about to get. It has my favorite party of all time. It has my favorite Final Fantasy character of all time in the form of Auron, and who's definitely a contender for my all-time favorite video game character of all time, tied with only another other character. And just looking at its overall legacy is just amazing. I mean, some people would say that its follow-up, Final Fantasy X-2 wasn't quite as good, which I openly do agree, but I don't think it really did anything to hurt it. I think it, does a solid job of standing on its own, and rest assured, in like a couple of years when this thing reaches its 20th anniversary, I'll be sure to talk a little bit more about this game. But I just think it's the fact that out of any other game, I own this game on more platforms than any other. I mean, I own this on PlayStation 2, I own it on PlayStation 3, I own it on PlayStation 4, I own it on PlayStation Vita, and heck, I even got it on the Switch. Even when I accidentally ended up winning my Nintendo Switch in like an arcade game, the first game I thought about picking up for it was Final Fantasy X, and I just started binge playing that sucker ever the moment I got it, and I enjoyed it just as much now as I did when I was younger. It still stands the test of time. I mean, there's just so many things about that game that are just amazing. I mean, you had great characters, great art style. It has my favorite use of Aeons. It has my favorite Aeon setup design. I mean, just the story itself was so personal, even for me at the time, and I liked how it dealt with real issues, or not really issues, but real topics that even today I still think about in terms of how the game focused on, the dangers of, blind devotion to religion and dealing with family issues with one's father, which is something I was definitely experiencing around that time when I was, the main protagonist's age. And just thinking about what that game means to me, it brings back a lot of great memories. Now, there's, been some talk about what more you could do with it, and there were rumors spreading for several years about a possible 10-3 game that still exists today. And in fact, I think I've read a few articles recently, like I would say as early as last week, about them talking about what the potential story could be. And if you actually picked up, I believe, the limited edition version of, I believe, Final Fantasy X, I believe PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, it actually does have those audio logs talking about exactly what the story of a 10-3 would be. And I'll just say personally, I'm really not too fond of the direction that they went. I just would prefer that the game stuck with its ending with, Final Fantasy X-2. I mean, don't get me wrong, the story for X-2 is a little all over the place, but I do think that depending on how much you actually accomplish, I do think that the perfect ending is probably the best ending you could possibly ask for for Final Fantasy X storyline. If anything, I always felt personally that I think that a prequel story would be even better in terms of following Lord Braska's pilgrimage with Jecht and Auron. I mean, you get little snippets of that in little memory spheres spread throughout the game that kind of show you what Braska, Jecht, and Auron were doing when they reached a certain location. And especially once you got to Zanarkand and you got to see Auron's memories about the final summoning, was really, really heartbreaking to kind of see what the final result with that was going to be. I think a prequel game centered around those three could do a lot in terms of just kind of filling in what made Braska's pilgrimage different from Yuna's, because it's very obvious that Yuna had gone through things that Braska necessarily didn't have to go through, even though we know what the final result of his pilgrimage would end up being. I still think that the journey itself would make for a fantastic game. I mean, there's a number of other franchises I think that could use a really good prequel game, and Final Fantasy X is definitely one of the games I think you definitely could benefit from. And it would. I think even just personally for me, it would go a long way in terms of fleshing out or giving me a little bit more insight in Auron's character, or as he was as a young man, because some people don't tend to notice this, but Tidus, and I like to call him Tidus. Some people say Tidus. I'm saying Tidus. I have my reasons. I would say that there's a lot of characteristics about Tidus that kind of remind you of how a young Auron was, and so I think there's a reason why those two guys have somewhat of a connection. So you could say that the way that Auron is probably how a much older, more mature version of Tidus would end up being, and I think that's tempting to kind of see what a future game would be. But again, I'm one of the few people who doesn't really think that a 10-3 game would necessarily be necessary, because I have my concerns in terms of the current state that Square Enix is in terms of their story direction for certain games, and I just don't want them to try to mess it up, because after seeing what they did with another precious game in the franchise, I'm very hesitant. So I would just kind of prefer that they leave the story of Final Fantasy X the way it is and just not try to change it up. It's perfect just the way it is. Even after 20 years, there's really nothing about that story that I would want to either add or want to change. I think it's fine just the way it is. And I'm very, very protective of this game, and I cherish just a lot of great memories. I've spent hundreds of hours playing it. I've replayed this game more times than any other game in existence, and it's probably gonna stay that way till the day I die. I mean, it currently holds the standing of being my second favorite video game of all time, and that's perfectly fine when I consider what number one is going to be. But this is the game that I very much judge almost every JRPG that I've played since then too, and only a few of them have been able to rise up to its level, as I said earlier. But again, I truly do love this game more than most, and I'm happy to say that there are other people that feel the same way I do, and there's other people who think this game is awful, and that's perfectly fine. I can understand where their errors are coming from. They think there's a lot of things about this thing that's silly and stupid, and certain story elements don't make sense, but they make sense to me. So yeah, I just want to say thank you Squaresoft, even though technically Squaresoft doesn't exist anymore, for creating a true masterpiece of a game that has stood the test of time. And heck, I might even still be talking more about this, in another 10 years when this game becomes 30 years old. Because heck, this is definitely a game that I certainly would love to one day eventually end up streaming if people would be interested in seeing that. So yeah, that's pretty much mostly all I want to say in order to help celebrate the 20th anniversary of my favorite JRPG of all time. However, I would like to say that I am also currently working on another ranking video involving Final Fantasy X that I hope to get out possibly tomorrow for sure. So I would keep my eyes open for that. So that's pretty much all I would like to just say about Final Fantasy X. I hope you guys enjoyed this little anniversary video. If you did happen to enjoy it, I would really appreciate if you give this video a thumbs up. Make sure you subscribe to keep track of me and my future videos. And if you have played Final Fantasy X, I would like to know, what is your personal favorite moment in the game itself? Share your thoughts with me and everyone else in the comments down below. And like always, thank you guys for watching. You're awesome, and I will see you next time.